Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our advanced series on how to critically review research articles. Today, we are going to explore a critical but often underdeveloped area of critique, the sociocultural and political context of research. Whether we are analyzing a paper in applied linguistics or a broader social science study, this dimension reveals the hidden forces shaping research choices, interpretations, and implications. Let's dive deep into what this really means. The core principle here is research is not conducted in a vacuum. The idea might sound like a slogan, but it is foundational. Researchers are always influenced by the social, political, historical, and cultural conditions in which they live, work, and publish. Even the most objective study is shaped by context. To put it plainly, we write what a researcher chooses to study, how they frame it, who they study, and how they interpret the findings. All of that is filtered through layers of ideology, identity, history, and politics. So, in a critical review, you're not just evaluating the findings, you're evaluating the conditions that make the research possible and possibly problematic. Now, let's talk about why reviewing the sociocultural and political context of a study so important when we are doing a critical review, not just in applied linguistics, but across all social sciences. First, we say research is not conducted in a vacuum. But what does that actually mean? It means every research project is situated in a wider social, cultural, and political environment. And understanding that environment helps us uncover three key things. One, reveals hidden ideologies. Many studies appear neutral on the surface, but carry underlying ideologies, often without the authors being fully aware of them. For instance, a paper may frame English as a superior or global language without discussing the colonial history that gave it that status. That's an ideology. It presents a power structure as if it were neutral, natural, or universal. As reviewers, we need to uncover these assumptions. For example, a study evaluating students deficient English in a multilingual African context might actually be promoting a monolingual norm rooted in colonial educational practices. Two, helps identify bias and positionality. Every researcher has a position: social, cultural, economic, educational. And that position influences the questions they ask, the methods they choose, the way they interpret results. Critical reviewers should ask, did the researcher acknowledge their own standpoint? If a male researcher studies female silence in classrooms but never reflects on its gender or cultural position, that's a red flag. Bias doesn't make a study invalid, but ignoring it makes it less trustworthy. For example, a Western trained academic studying student silence in East Asian classrooms must account for their own cultural lens and expectations about participation. Three, supports ethical critique. When we ignore sociocultural context, we risk reinforcing systems of inequality. Ethical critique means asking who benefits from this research, who might be harmed. Research isn't just an academic exercise, it can influence policy, funding, pedagogy, and real people's lives. So we have a responsibility to examine its social impact. For example, studies promoting integration through language for refugees may ignore whether the policies they support are experienced as empowering or as forced assimilation. So the takeaway is understanding the sociocultural and political context isn't just intellectual, it is ethical, it's practical, and it's necessary for deeper academic rigor. Let's look at the first scenario, an English language policy in post-colonial contexts. Let's say you are reading a study titled The Impact of English Medium Instruction on Academic Performance in Tanzanian universities. At first glance, it's an empirical statistical study, test scores before and after EMI implementation. But a critical reviewer must ask, why English? Why now? Who benefits from EMI and who is left behind? Is this improvement in performance really learning or just adapting to a system that favors the elite? Now, let's give this scenario some political and historical teeth. Historical context. Tanzania promoted Kiswahili as a national language after independence to foster unity and decolonize education. English, however, has remained the language of prestige, power, and international capital. The socio-political layer is the push for EMI today may reflect a new liberal agenda to align local education with global markets. But it also reintroduces linguistic hierarchies rooted in colonialism. So the critical review application is we need to write, while the study documents positive academic outcomes under EMI, it fails to engage with the socio-political implications of privileging English in post-colonial Tanzania. This omission masks structural inequalities whereby students from new rural or disadvantaged backgrounds, less proficient in English, are systematically marginalized. The study also treats EMI as a neutral medium, ignoring its colonial legacy and current ideological function in global education. Scenario 2, gender and classroom talk in East Asia. Imagine a qualitative study titled Turn-Taking Patterns in Mixed Gender EFL Classrooms in Japan. The paper finds that male students dominate speaking time. But wait, don't just describe the findings. Dig into the context. The sociocultural context is Japanese culture often emphasizes hierarchy, group harmony called wa, and indirectness. Gender roles are still traditionally constructed in many settings. Public speaking in mixed gender groups may be experienced differently by female learners. So, what is missing? Did the researcher acknowledge how cultural norms shape classroom dynamics? Were the researcher's own beliefs about gender and communication made transparent? Were teacher beliefs and social expectations influencing who speaks and how? Now, the critical review application here is we should write, while the study describes the frequency of male versus female speech turns, it does not sufficiently interrogate how Japanese gender norms and educational hierarchies mediate participation. Nor does it explore the ways in which the classroom culture, teacher expectations, or peer pressure reinforce or challenge these dynamics. The lack of reflexivity regarding the researcher's own gender and positionality is also a missed opportunity for deeper analysis. Look at scenario 3, refugee literacy programs in Europe, for example. Now, consider a study titled Integrating Refugee Adults Through Literacy Education in Germany. Sounds progressive, right? But here is a catch. Literacy is never neutral. The political context is in Europe, refugee integration is often framed through the lens of scrutization. Learning the host language is not just a tool for communication. It becomes a gatekeeping mechanism. It's linked to access to welfare, employment, and legal status. So the review questions are, is literacy being treated as empowerment or surveillance? Are refugees participants or subjects of state control? Who gets to define what counts as literacy? So the critical review application here is the article presents literacy as a benevolent tool for integration, but fails to address the coercive undertones of such programs in asylum contexts. The framing of refugees as passive recipients of education reproduces deficit discourses and overlooks their multilingual resources. Furthermore, the study lacks engagement with a broader political discourse that ties language proficiency to moral worth and deservingness. Let me give you a structured way to approach this in your review, in your review writing. All right, let's take a moment to unpack some key dimensions that we should always consider when critically engaging with a research study. I'll walk you through them one by one, and I'll pose some guiding questions you can ask yourself as you read or evaluate any piece of research. First up, the cultural dimension. We have to ask, are the local beliefs, values, norms, and power relations shaping the study's assumptions? And more importantly, are those influences made explicit? You see, every study is shaped by a particular cultural context, whether it's acknowledged or not. So the question is, has the researcher taken the time to be transparent about that, or are we just getting a universalized view that might not actually apply everywhere? Next, the historical angle. We should be asking, does the study acknowledge how past events or policies affect the present issue? Or is it treating the present as if it just popped out of nowhere, completely disconnected from history? That's what we call being ahistorical. As a serious problem, especially when we are dealing with topics like inequality, migration, or education systems. History matters, it shapes the present. Then we have got the political dimension. This one's big. Ask yourself, are power structures, whether governmental, institutional, or ideological, framing the research agenda? In other words, who's influencing what gets studied, how it gets studied, and why? Research doesn't happen in a vacuum. So we need to be alert to whose interests are being served, even in subtle ways. Now, the ethical dimension. Here is a tough but important question. Is the research complicit in reinforcing inequalities? Does it unintentionally, or maybe even intentionally, serve dominant interests? Ethical research doesn't just mean following procedural rules, it also means thinking about impact, who benefits and who might be harmed. Finally, positionality. This is about the researcher themselves. Have they acknowledged their own identity, background, funding sources, and potential biases? Every researcher brings their own lens to the table. There is no such thing as a completely neutral perspective. So we want to know, have they been reflexive? Have they been honest about where they're coming from? So to sum it up, when we look at a study, let's not just ask what it found. Let's dig deeper and ask, how was it done? Who shaped it? And who stands to gain or lose from it? That's how we do responsible, critical reading of research. The common pitfalls in articles are: number one, overgeneralization across contexts. The study in English anxiety in Korea is applied to Asian learners as a whole. Silencing of marginalized voices, like in the studies of EMI, teacher or policymaker perspective, dominate while the students are barely coded. Uncritical use of global norms. The CEFR is treated as a universal standard without discussing its European roots and cultural assumptions. The illusion of objectivity. A quantitative study on language proficiency doesn't explain what language proficiency means, for whom, and why. Now, advanced critical review sentences to model. Let me give you a few sentences you can adapt into your writing. The author treats the concept of a standard English as ideologically neutral, overlooking the radical, racialized, and colonial baggage embedded in global language hierarchies. Another one. While the methodology is robust, the analysis remains depoliticized. It fails to acknowledge how state policy constructs language learners as either assets or burdens. The absence of historical context in a study of language reform in Tunisia weakens the analysis by serving current practices from the roots in colonial and post-colonial policy shifts. Next, the researcher's position as a Western academic collecting data in rural Indonesia raises important ethical questions about representation and epistemic power, none of which are addressed in the paper. Final thoughts. So, next time you review an article, don't just ask, was the methodology sound? Ask instead, who gets to define the problem? What social forces are at play? Whose voices are missing and why? Does this research challenge the status quo or reinforce it? This level of critical awareness transforms you from a reader into a conscious scholar. It's how we begin to decolonize knowledge, challenge academic gatekeeping, and bring about more equitable research practices. So, to conclude, I want to emphasize three critical takeaways that should shape how we approach research moving forward. First, we need to critique context, not just method. It's easy to focus solely on whether a method is valid or rigorous, but without understanding the broader social, cultural, institutional, and even linguistic context in which research is embedded, we risk missing the deeper implications of our findings. Research doesn't happen in a vacuum, and neither should our critiques. Second, we must always remember that research is political. The questions we ask, the participants we choose, the frameworks we adopt, all of these are value-laden decisions. Whether we acknowledge it or not, our work reflects and sometimes reinforces existing power structures. So, being aware of this political dimension isn't optional. It's part of doing responsible scholarship. And finally, reflexivity leads to better scholarship. Taking the time to examine our own positions, assumptions, and potential biases allows us to conduct research that is not only more ethical, but also more insightful. Reflexivity isn't a sign of weakness or uncertainty. It's a marker of intellectual honesty and academic maturity. So, as you move forward with your own research, I encourage you to keep these principles in mind, not just ideals as ideas, but as active practices that shape the integrity and impact of your work. And that brings us to where we are heading next. In our upcoming session, we will dive deeper into critical literacy and power relations, looking closely at how certain voices and ideologies dominate our academic spaces, while others are silenced or sidelined. We'll explore questions like who gets to speak, who gets cited, what kinds of knowledge are privileged, and what's left out. We'll also unpack what it means to take a critical stance, not just in theory, but in practice. This involves examining how power operates in the various structures of research and knowledge production, and how we, as scholars and educators, can begin to disrupt those patterns. So if today was about recognizing that research is never neutral, next time is about equipping ourselves to act on that awareness. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you. Thank you.